Hey everyone, George here, and welcome back to The Art of Water. One of the things I wanted to talk to you today about was design. That's a real big topic that seems to be something that a lot of people ask me about uh, periodically, and so I thought I would get into it a little bit today, the importance of design and the importance of planning your escape out and coming up with some ideas that are really something that you are really going to enjoy over a long period of time. Because some of these escapes we keep for a very long period of time. Other people, like me, sometimes maybe not so much. We like to escape and change our escapes so often that it really is something that we want to create is obviously beautiful, and we want it to be all of those things, but we don't necessarily plan on keeping that design for a tremendous amount of time. So let's talk about design a little bit and what I think are the three main important goals to achieve when you were talking about design, and what we really should be thinking about and planning for whenever we're putting escape together. And just something that when we do start, we have a game plan, something that we really are going to like because we've thought it out a lot, and we know that what we envision in our brain is something that we want to see in that small little chunk of water or a larger chunk of water or whatever. But anyways, let's kind of get to that. Number one, the most important thing I think is when you're designing a tank to think about something that is really important to me, and sort of a rule that I have followed ever since I've been in this. I started out scaping by watching people like James Finley with the Green Machine, George Farmer, Green Aqua, people like that that really have a tremendous amount of knowledge about design and input. And all of those people that I mentioned there are virtually the same as me on the idea of what's important as far as the rules that we follow on designing a tank. Number one is what I call the rule of thirds, or what everyone calls the rule of thirds. It's also called the golden rule. And that is designing your tank with a flow in mind of having that design of thirds that sort of catch the eye correctly. It's so important that we do that, because when you look at a tank, now some tanks you can't do that with. When you're talking about small little nano tanks, you can do that to a certain degree, but you can't really implement that 100% because you have such a small area to work with, and there's really only so much you can do. Actually, that's not true. Your imagination will take you any place you want to go, and you can do just about anything you can think of if you really want to put the work and the effort into it. And so I said, the rule of thirds, or the golden rule, is so important for the flow and design of the tank that if you're using that, you're really going to be happy with the end result. The second thing I talk about is picking out the hardscape substrate that you're going to be using for your tank. What are the main parts of the hardscape that you're going to be using going to do to affect the design that you have in mind for that specific tank? And I think the important thing to keep in mind with that is that whenever you're designing a tank, figure out what kind of rock you're going to use, what kind of substrate you're going to use, and what kind of wood you're going to use. Plants are a whole other thing. We can talk about that after we're done talking about this. But it is so important to figure out, am I going to use Frodo stone? Am I going to use maple stone? Am I going to use dragon stone? Am I going to use Ceres stone? There are so many different kinds of stone out there that you can use and implement into your design that you're not limited by anything. But all of them have different characteristics to them as far as how they affect your water, as far as pH, hardness, all kinds of different things. So you need to put some thought into that. But you also need to think about the shape of the stones. What kind of look am I going for here? Am I looking for the rounded edges? Am I looking for something slightly different than that? Something that has sharper edges on it, that is mountainous and whatever. Like I said, our imaginations can go wild on these kinds of things. So it's really important to figure that out and to be very patient when you're setting up the hardscape in your tank. And the reason I say that is because a lot of times people will pencil out something and they really haven't put it in their tank in a way that they like. They like it on paper, but they don't necessarily like the way it looks in the tank. So what I recommend is taking 2 or 3 days to move the stones around in your tank and your wood around in your tank, and anything that you might need to have glued as far as wood maybe needs a piece of platform of stone or whatever that weights it down. There can be all kinds of things that you might run into that may change your idea on what you're going to be doing with the design of that tank. So take 2 or 3 days, look at it, move things around and get it exactly the way you want it before you start planting anything. Because if you don't and you get in the middle of the planting part of the design of the aquarium, you're really going to be frustrated with what you've done and be a little disheartened, to be honest with you, because it can be very, very expensive and it can be very frustrating when you're not achieving the design goal that you had in mind. So, like I said, be extremely patient. Patience is everything in this hobby. If you're not patient, you don't belong in this hobby. I'm just going to say that straight out, because this hobby is all about patience and disappointment, because it will not only be rewarding as all get out, but it'll also sometimes disappoint you. But 90% of those times, the disappointment comes from yourself, where you made a mistake, you got into a hurry, and you didn't take your time. And again, like I said, take 2 or 3 days, think about your design, put that in the tank with your substrate in there and move things around. Substrate is so easy to move around. You just take a brush and you can pretty much wipe away anything that you've put in there by just moving the substrate around with a paintbrush or a tool that is used for that, and you won't disappoint yourself. Now, the other part of that is when you're putting your substrate in, are you going to be putting it in from a corner and building it up to another corner? You have to think about that. Is your design going to be from the front to the back, where the front is lower, and as you build to the back, you're going to get higher? That's for dimension purposes. That's so important because it will give you a sense of depth in your tank that is extremely important to the way it's going to look ultimately. And that is a very, very important part of what we're talking about here. Now, the third thing that I want to talk about is really thinking about the size of tank that you want and the shape of the tank. Do you want a cube type tank? Do you want a rectangular shaped tank? Do you want a bow front tank? There are so many different tanks out there these days. It's just endless. So think about all of that stuff, and think about lighting as well. What kind of plants am I going to be using in this scape? And are those plants going to require difficult lighting that's really expensive, or are they going to be moderate to low care plants where they don't need a lot of light? It's really important to think about those things ahead of time, because you don't want to get your design all put together, because once you start that design and you've picked out your plants and you haven't thought about the lighting, you're really going to run into trouble, because you're going to need a certain kind of lighting for every plant that you put in that tank. You want to put plants in that tank that require the same kind of lighting or as close to it as you can possibly get, so that you're designing a tank around the plants that are all going to have similar needs as far as lighting goes. So today we're going to limit ourselves to design only. We're not going to talk about water parameters. We're not going to get into fish that we're going to stock in tanks and whatever. The only thing I would say about stocking fish is when you're doing your design, what kinds of fish do you have in mind that can live in the environment that you are planning? If it's a Zen type aquarium where there isn't a lot of plants and they're all low growing sort of carpet plants and mosses and just a few pieces of wood here and there, and is mostly a barren scape of some kind, you've got to think about the kinds of fish that you're going to be choosing as well, because that's important. That is important. We're not going to get into it much more than that, but I am going to say that that is a very important aspect to all of this that you need to really think about when you're designing your tank. Think about what kind of fish you're going to put in there and the kind of design that you have in mind. Now, the final thing I'm going to say about design before we start looking at some different tanks in this room here. This is my office area, and I have about 6 tanks in here. Some you can't see because they're not on camera right now. They're either behind the camera or they're off to this side of the camera. But we're going to go through a couple of different designs and talk about them, and then we'll end the video there. But the last an important part of design, I think, is using your imagination about what kind of look you're going for that maybe you've seen in the woods, maybe you've seen in the mountains, maybe you've seen in a stream area, or you've seen in a jungly area or a wooded area. I mean, it is just endless. But think about that. Go out and take some photographs. Take some photographs of areas that you like and would like to see implemented into a tank, so that you have an idea on how you want that tank to look. And I'm telling you, it is an endless amount of design ideas that you can have out there. You're only limited by what your imagination will allow. Anyways, with that said, let's start looking at a couple of different tanks here that I think are going to give you a perspective on design and help you to decide what's best for you. Anyways, let's get to it. So one of the first things that I want to do is look at this particular tank right here in front of us here. Now this tank here is an aqua top. It is a 7.13 gallon tank, so it is a cube, and it is a low iron glass in here, so very clear, crystal clear glass, no distortion whatsoever, and just a real pretty tank to look at. Now the design that we have here is sort of an island type design. Now what happens when you're using a cube type tank is the design, unless the cube's much bigger than what we have here, is really limited to certain things. Now, the first thing I would tell you is when you're picking out your stones, do not put even amounts, excuse me, let me correct that. Do not put even amounts of stone in a tank this small, because it will be something you'll recognize and it will really throw off the whole sort of feel of the tank. You want odd numbers, because the odd numbers for some reason just seem to draw our eye in the way that we want it to. So having said that, what I would suggest to you is that if you look at this particular tank here, we're using maple stone, which is a very common stone these days. It's not hard to find. You can usually find it at your supplier, or if you can't find it at your supplier, you can find it online. Usually you can get about 15 pounds of that, which this is not even close to that if you've got a larger tank that you're thinking about doing, for around $35. I've seen it cheaper than that, a look around for sales or whatever. But if your supplier doesn't have it, you can find it online for sure. The other thing we're looking at here is we talked about that rule of thirds and how we have a higher end here and it drops down and drops off over on this side. Now we could have that reversed and that would be fine too. But in this particular case, that's not what we have here. We have what we call an island style design. And this design here is very common, and it's actually a very beautiful design because the sense of depth when you're looking at the tank, take a second to look at it because it's really important that we see that the sense of depth is just so right there that you can see it. You can see how the substrate starts at here and it works its way back, and I would tell you that it ends about this high in the back here. You wouldn't be able to tell that by looking at it because all of our design has been moved in this direction. Now, as far as the hardscape in here, we have 3 stones in here, one which is larger, and then we have another larger, slightly smaller than this one, so that we keep that perception of height down, and then an even shorter one in the front here so that we get that sense of depth. That's very important. Now the only thing that's in this tank as far as stock is a betta fish, 2 Siamese algae eaters, and a couple of snails. That is really the extent of the livestock in this tank. Now I chose this tank for this betta because he was in a 3.5 gallon tank and I felt bad for him in there and wanted to give him more room. I really like this fish. He's a midnight black betta, really kind of a hard fish to find locally. You can get them online pretty readily. They're a little more expensive, but they're beautiful fish. Now you're going to see that he's chasing this Siamese algae eater around a little bit, and that's because I've only had these fish in this tank for approximately a week, and they are still getting settled in and understanding their territory. So you got to be careful with that because a lot of times the betta fish is not going to kill those Siamese algae eaters because he's not going to be able to catch them, but he's going to wear them out pretty fast. Now what happens is at some point everybody settles into their own part of the tank, and like I said, this has only been set up for approximately a week, and that's not enough time to really get settled in here. But the plants that are being used in here are pretty much Anubias petite nana, Anubias congenius, and we have some repens in here that are carpet plants. And then in the back we have some swords that you can't see because the stones are in the way. They're very immature plants. Those will grow. We have a few ferns back there. And we also have some green cardinal. I'm not going to use the scientific names because that's not necessary. We're just talking about design today. It's not necessary for us to get involved in... oh, I forgot. There is a Picosimus in here too, a very small Picosimus. If you're looking for something that's going to keep your algae down, number one, I don't have problems with algae because I do a lot of water changes and I use my light and I plant my tanks as heavy as I possibly can to make sure that the plants are competing with the algae and not the other way around. And we have very limited problems with algae. You're going to have some algae that's just normal in every single tank, but if you have the right kinds of things in there, shrimp, snails, and algae eater type fish, you're just not going to have these issues. You can have an explosion of algae if your balances are off and whatever. Now this tank was automatically cycled because what I had for substrate in here I just continued to use, as well as the filtration. The only thing I did was redesign the tank. So with that being said, this is a little bit different scenario than we might have with a tank that is set up brand new. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. I want to limit this video in time, so we're going to move on to the next tank that I want to show you that's a slightly different design and something that's you're going when you see it, you're going to know what I'm talking about, that it's needing a little bit of care, and we'll talk about that when we move on to it. Now this tank here, when we start out talking about this, the first thing I want to show you is this tank needs some maintenance. I've been gone for a couple of weeks here off and on. I just haven't had a chance to actually do the kind of maintenance I normally do on trimming the plants and that sort of thing. So you'll see that the repens up here in the front area of the tank are getting rather tall, and they will do that. They won't get much taller than that, but they all need to be trimmed down. Now, one of the things that's a very positive thing about having these repens in the front like this is the clippings that you take from them can actually be taken directly and put right back into the soil, and they will root. And as long as you don't have fish in here that are rambunctious type fish that are going to, run by them and run through them and pull them up, they'll do just fine. But as far as that goes, really there isn't anything else in here. I'm thinking maybe some of these taller ones right here in the front will move to the back a little ways here. They're good, healthy plants. They're well established. Those are some pieces of crypt. Actually, I'm not sure if those are actually crypts or not. I actually believe those are ferns, but no, those are crypts. Those are a variety of crypt. And then we have some Anubias in here again. We have the Anubias congenius, Anubias nana. We also have in the back a plant that I don't know how it got there. I have no idea. I don't remember ever planting that there. But on both sides, for whatever reason, I have a plant, and I don't even know the name of it. But as far as hardscape in here, what we have is dragonstone. I love this particular dragonstone because of its color. The color of it is a red hue that I don't normally see in dragonstone. Normally dragonstone has a little bit of red in it here and there, but this was just a particularly beautiful batch of dragonstone, and I don't really know where it came from. I bought it online because my supplier was out. And I just love the color of it, though. If you look at it, it's got just a beautiful contrast to it. Black backgrounds, I go for that, or I go for what I call a frosted look background, just to hide everything. In this particular case, the filtration system and everything is built in here, and the black background is not really something that's hard to put on there. It's a very small area that requires it. The filtration system that's in there, which you can't even see because it sort of blends in with it. You would never know that there is a filter that sticks out about a quarter of the way in the back of that tank because of the black background and how well it was done. It just simply blends in. But again, we have this sort of flow in this direction here with the stone and the plants. There is no wood in this particular cube. Now, this is a Aquatop as well. This is a 5.0 gallon, and it is really just a delightful little tank to work with. I have about 5 or 6 of these in my home, and I absolutely love them. They all take the same filtration, so they're easy to maintain. You can actually yank the whole filter right out of there and unplug it, pull it right out, and take it in and clean it, bring it back in, and it's just so much easier to clean than anything I've ever worked with. I like those ideas that Aquatop came up with to sort of combine the filtration right into the system and make it really easy to maintain. The lighting on both of the tanks that I just showed you came with it. All the plants that are in here require moderate to low light. Par right around 30 to 35 is what you get out of these, and that seems to be really good for ferns, reps, even most of the Anubias family. You can get away with that, as well as many other plants that I don't want to go through a whole laundry list of plants here, but there's so many. But look at the packages when you're getting your plants and see what kind of lights they require, and do a check on what kind of par you're getting from your lights. The easiest way to do that is with a light meter if you don't have one. Lots of times your supplier will have one that they'll let you rent out or borrow for a day, and you can get a good idea as to what kind of plants are going to do well in the tank here. Now, like I said, this tank, as I said, does not have any wood in there. And the reason why, and I'm going to get back to this because it was important, the reason why I have no wood in here is because the red hue of that dragonstone, every piece of wood I put in there, it was just competing with it and blending in with it. And I just thought, you know, it just doesn't look right. And I don't really need to have that piece of wood in there to have a nice flow. Now, the stock in this tank are some cardinals. I have about 7 of those, and I have about 5 neon green rasporas. And other than that, there's just a couple of Siamese algae eaters. I'm not sure exactly if there are some autocinclids in here or some Siamese algae eaters. One of the two is in this tank. And I also, of course, have some snails in here as well. But as far as stock goes, that's really about it. So I've given you 2 ideas on designs. And we're going to talk more about that in my next video, because this is a 2-part series on designs where we're actually going to be building a 40-gallon Zen style tank, which I think is going to be absolutely beautiful, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. But as far as design goes, these are 2 different designs here with different materials and different ideas on the planting, but similar in lots of ways, because like I said, with cubes that are tiny like that and are designed for nano-size aquariums, you're really sort of limited on the size. And that just is something that I think is really important, that you get that part right before you sit down and start doing all the work. Like I said early on, get that design down on paper, move things around as far as hardscape. Once you have your substrate in there, move your hardscape around along with your wood and your larger rocks to make sure that you've got that design that you really, really were hoping to get. Anyways, we've talked about that, and I'm going to have a few closing words about this particular video and talk about some things that are coming up, and we'll get to that in just a second.